Hello, everyone. We've got 5 participants here this evening. Welcome to everyone. And we will also have people that will be hopefully watching the recording from the comfort of their homes. So hello to all of you as well. Just wanted to check in about assessment. I've had lots and lots of people emailing me, their an example of an observation or their big picture critical reflection, just to make sure that they're on the right track. And as I've said before, I'm happy for you to do that if you want to. This is an assessment, as I said, being in your second placement now, you need to get a satisfactory in all of the criteria. So I really want to make sure that you're on track for everything. That's really important. We will have a couple of weeks where I'll do individual Zoom sessions as well, instead of doing workshops. So you can book in to have an individual Zoom session with me if you're concerned at all about the assessment task. No, because my aim is for everyone to pass this unit. And I see no reason why you can't, because basically this assessment task, it's very much what you did on placement. And so if you've got good observations and you've done a good critical reflection, I don't think you're going to have any issues at all. Any questions from anyone here this evening? No? Okay. Excellent. But do remember, I'll put an email out reminding you that you can book in to have an individual Zoom session with me and we can screen share and we can have a chat about what you've done, just to make sure you're on the right track. Okay. So as you can see on the slide, we've got an overview of what we're going to be looking at this evening. We've got quite a lot to go through. It's a really important topic. So as you can see up there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to get rid of most of the first part of what I'm going to talk about. It's very talky, so I might remove the video screens so that we can see the full screen. Bear with me for one moment. There we go. Okay, so you can see what we're going to go through there. And what I'm also going to do is, because a lot of you will be watching the recording, I'm going to put a Padlet up on Blackboard. And this is just in case there are any particular questions that you have about any of the material that we're going to go through, because, we've got quite a few of you that couldn't make it tonight, it's all good. There are many different ways to participate in the unit content, and I try to cater for everyone. I know we've got a lot of students out there working long hours as well as studying, so I'm really conscious of that, and I try and provide as much variety as possible in terms of ways that you can engage with the content. Okay, now as I'm going, if you do have any questions, please unmute your mic and you're welcome to ask. Or if you feel more comfortable, you can pop a message in the chat. Okay, so this session, it contains material and discussion about topics that relate to child abuse and neglect. So it may be a difficult topic for some of you. So I really want you to notice how it makes you feel, and I want you to think about it. It's absolutely normal to feel different emotions when you engage with information about child maltreatment. So if you need to talk through anything associated with today's session, you're welcome to have a chat with me. But there are also some really wonderful resources at QUT and in your community to help. So if you or someone that you know requires help, further detail can be found on slides in this presentation. So even though this information, it can be quite challenging, I do believe that children deserve for us to know about it. So some of it is quite confronting. So I always like to give a warning before I continue on. Okay. So the child protection movement, it has its origins right back in the 19th century. So, although mistreatment of children at the hands of their parents was common, the cases were rarely acted upon by the courts. So, way back in 1874, it saw the landmark case in the US of Mary Ellen McCormack. So, she was a 10-year-old girl who experienced chronic physical abuse by her adoptive mother in New York. So at the age of 10, she was actually the size of a 5-year-old. And at the time, there were no laws to protect children from cruelty of any sort. So neighbours who observed Mary Ellen's neglected condition, they approached the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. So on investigation, a whip was found in her home, and her arms and legs were covered in whip marks and bruises. So the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals took the case to court, and they found Mary Ellen was placed, was being abused, and she was placed in an orphanage, and her caregiver was actually imprisoned. So soon after this, New York government actually developed the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children. This was established as the first child protection agency in the world. So this group advocated for child protection legislation and the establishment of juvenile courts in the United States. So there are many disagreements about acceptable and non-acceptable treatment of children. So many, one particular example of this is smacking. So although physical punishment of children is still accepted in our society, physical abuse is not. So in Queensland, harm is seen as any detrimental effect of a significant nature, and emphasis on the significant, on the child's physical, psychological, or emotional well-being. So for harm to be significant, the detrimental effect on the child's well-being has to be substantial or very serious. And it has to demonstrate or present in the child as, being fairly serious. So there are 5 defined types of abuse that we're going to explore this evening. And they include, as you can see on the slide, neglect, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and also exposure to domestic and family violence. So neglect includes both isolated instances as well as a pattern of failure over time on the part of the parent or other family members to provide for the development and well-being of the child. So where the parent is in a position to do so in one or more of the areas that you can see. So health, hygiene and nutrition, education, emotional development, shelter, and the safe supervised living conditions of the child. Courts may actually be reluctant to determine a child needs protection if the parents are struggling financially to provide for their children's basic needs. So in these situations, it's actually the responsibility of the state to provide support and assistance to the parents. And of course, the parents then have a responsibility to engage with and to utilize these supports. So physical abuse involves the intentional use of physical force against a child, so force that results in or has a high likelihood of resulting in harm to the child's health, survival, development, or dignity. So a lot of physical violence against children in the home is actually inflicted with the intention of punishment. So this may include physically hitting, shaking, throwing, kicking, beating, punching, burning, biting, cutting, pinching, restraining, or choking. Emotional abuse, it refers to a parent or caregiver's inappropriate verbal or symbolic acts towards a child. And this may also include a pattern of failure over time to provide the child with adequate nurturing and, also emotional availability. So emotional abuse takes 5 main behavioral forms. One of them is ignoring. So this is where the adult deprives the child of essential stimulation and responsiveness. So this stifles emotional growth and also cognitive development. Rejecting, so of course where the adult refuses to acknowledge the child's worth and the legitimacy of the child's needs. Isolating, this is where the adult actually cuts the child off from normal social experiences, where they prevent them from forming friendships. And this is, I guess, where it can make the child believe that they're very much alone in the world. Terrorizing is another one. This is, would include the adult verbally assaulting the child, bullying and frightening them, or also creating a climate of fear where I guess the child over time would believe that the world is generally a hostile place. And this really does impact on normal social development and experience. Corrupting. So this is when the adult, encourages the child to engage in antisocial behavior and sometimes destructive. And this can inhibit exposure to positive social experiences and the development of social skills. And this would also include, I guess, the modeling of inappropriate behavior as well. So, of course, these acts or omissions, they're likely to damage a child's self-esteem and, of course, their social and emotional development. And, of course, there's also the possibility of the child developing bullying behaviours. So any questions at all at this point? No? No questions? Okay. Everyone okay? Good. Just checking in. Okay, so the next one is sexual abuse, and I'm actually going to give you the opportunity to read through this slide yourselves. So as I said before, this it can be quite unnerving for some of you. that, as I said, even though this information can be challenging, I do believe that it's important that we have an understanding of it, and children really do deserve for us to know about it. And we're going to talk quite a bit about your role in reporting different forms of abuse as well. Okay, so forcing a child or a young person to live in an environment where the primary caregiver experiences sustained violence in itself, it can be seen as emotional and psychological abuse. So children and young people who are forced to live with violence, they're at an increased risk of experiencing physical and sexual abuse. So these children and young people, they tend to experience significant disruptions in their psychosocial well-being. So often exhibiting a similar pattern or symptoms to other abused or neglected children. So this is exposure to family violence can actually be as traumatic as experiencing it. It's something that we don't often consider. So these are the 4 sources that were chosen, excuse me, as pre-workshop readings. They were chosen to provide you with an in-depth understanding of the research around important statistics and information. They provide a really good critical understanding of the definitions, indicators, and short and long-term effects of the 4 subgroups of child abuse. So the first one is the Australian Institute for Family Studies website. And this gives an excellent overview and some definitions of the 5 subheadings, but also it talks about some difficulties and some controversies around these definitions. I'll actually share some of these with you in a moment. So the second is a textbook written for teachers and other professionals who work with children. So it provides some indicators of the 5 subgroups, and it also outlines some preventative measures, so including risk and protective factors that we're going to go into detail with soon. It also provided some important information on child protection systems in Australia and also some overseas. So the third one, it's a very interesting article, one of the first studies looking into the association between violence in childhood and educational outcomes of students. So this is one that I think would really benefit you having a look at. So the final one that was chosen, it presents the findings of a literature review, and it includes studies associated with educational outcomes for children in foster or extended family care. So again, it specifically looked at risk and protective factors to inform some important future interventions for these children and students. So I would really encourage you to have a look at these when you get the opportunity, or even if you want to include them in your toolbox as references for your professional practice, just to refer to. So this was a table that I popped on Blackboard. So I think for those of you that really do want to develop an in-depth understanding for your future professional practice, I'd like you to come back to this table after you've completed the readings and summarize the different types of maltreatment. So in the readings, it was noted that although there is a broad consensus on the 5 subtypes of child abuse and neglect, so the ones on the table, disagreement really does exist about exactly how to define these So, for example, some of the points, the ones that I thought were particularly interesting that were brought up, one of them was about parenting practices um, that may be acceptable in one culture, but may be considered abusive in another culture. So this is something that could be very relevant to your future practice. Of course, some parenting practices, of course, are abusive regardless of culture, but in terms of cultural awareness, it can be difficult to know the difference sometimes. So there was also debate in the literature on whether definitions of child abuse should refer to the parental behaviours or to the harm of the child, or whether evidence of both should be required for recognition of abuse. Sometimes it can be difficult to know whether the parental behaviours are harmful enough to constitute child abuse. So, for example, in neglect cases, practitioners, teachers, different stakeholders, they can have different perceptions about what might constitute good enough parenting or inappropriate parenting. So this is another important factor to consider. One of the readings also noted that the child protection legislation used in many Australian jurisdictions, it defines child abuse as a behaviour or action that causes a child significant harm. And, this can be difficult to know the point at which a child is suffering significant harm. What does this mean? And it may, again, mean something different to different people. One of the other points I think that I found particularly interesting was the question of, is child abuse and neglect an objective or subjective reality? So I think one of the examples that was given is if legislators, policymakers, and practitioners say that sexual relationships, for example, between a 19-year-old and a 15-year-old is sexual abuse, but the 15-year-old says that it's not, whose opinion holds the most weight? So the articles brought up lots and lots of different points like this, and I would really encourage you to have a read of them when you get the opportunity, because they're really important considerations that may or will, I think, in many cases for you, impact on your future teaching practices. So looking at the slide, these points were pulled out from the articles. We have some indicators of child abuse, and I'd like you to take a moment to read through the slide. And I think this is a slide that if I was you, I would come back to it and take some notes possibly, because I think it's important to have a good understanding of these indicators, especially because as future teachers, you will have a responsibility to report signs of child abuse if you're concerned. So have a read through them. I'll give you a bit more time. Okay, so as I said, I would suggest that you do take some notes of these as well. And they're very relevant for some of them for the birth to 2 group, but also for older children as well. Okay, so how common is it? In Australia, and this is coming from a recent study, the Australian Child Maltreatment Prevalence Study, and it noted that in Australia, in 1 year, there are on average 396,000 notifications to Child Protection Services. And these involved about 245,000 children. That's pretty astounding. So this is a rate of 44 children per 1,000 in the population. So 159,000 children received child protection services. 17% involved neglect, 59% involved emotional abuse, 15% involved physical abuse, and 9% sexual abuse. So it's also something important that came out of the study was that abuse can also involve multi-type maltreatment, or what they call poly-victimization. So with multiple victimizations of different kinds. So combinations, so such as sexual abuse, physical abuse, bullying, and exposure to family violence, not just multiple episodes of the same kind of victimization. It's also important to note that as you can see on the slide, 19% of the notifications in the year were from within schools. And also younger children are more vulnerable to abuse, and boys are more likely to be victims of physical abuse and girls for sexual abuse. So astoundingly, 45,800 children were admitted to out-of-home care in the year. And currently, this study is still underway as well. It's ongoing. So it's a nationwide survey of 10,000 Australians aged 16 and over. So it's a really important ongoing study. So often children in remote Australian communities are even at a greater risk of abuse. So they experience poverty at disproportionately higher rates, and they are more likely to be Indigenous. They're also more likely to live in unemployed households, possibly with single parent families, and in families where often the mother has a low educational attainment. And also, of course, they're more likely to be socially isolated and more likely to be exposed to family and domestic violence. And with that, have more contact with child protection services. Interestingly, they are less likely to engage in early childhood education and care services, and have poorer access to early childhood intervention services, so paediatricians and allied health and mental health services. So really important factors in remote Australia. So good old Bronfenbrenner. While I guess there are varying schools of thought on the origins of maltreatment, most theories, including Bronfenbrenner, recognise that the root causes can be organised into 4 principal systems with risk and protective factors. So these would extend across societies, families, and of course the individual child themselves. So Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems model provides a theoretical framework for coping with the complexity of the problem, defining the levels of influence for children and parents. So the immediate and possibly most powerful level of influence, as we know, the microsystem, is the family. And this is embedded, as we can see on the slide, within systems such as the neighbourhood and school and workplace. Bronfenbrenner, he describes this as the exosystem, which is contained within that broader macro system of the cultural context, of course, shaping what occurs at the inner levels. So the ecological model, it recognizes the interdependent interaction of the systems and very clearly the importance of the social context. So I guess we can look at factors like power imbalances, gender and age, also cultural settings and cultural-based parenting practices and beliefs that would explain why child abuse was more or less likely to occur across different cultures. Social environment is also another factor, as we said before, with parent employment situations, access to appropriate housing, health, nutrition. Nutrition is an important one, adequate childcare and schooling. So all important risk and protective factors depending on the individual family situation. Children's access to supportive adults outside the home was a very important protective factor. So access to a range of support services and professionals for families in crisis, and parents actually being aware of the availability of these support services as well. And we're going to talk about some of these a little bit later. Now, extremely relevant at this time, that access to support services. So some children in lockdown can be very vulnerable at this time because for some students, school is actually their safe haven, with their teachers, very importantly, providing a constant sense of belonging where they actually feel safe and included and accepted. So without school at the moment for some children in lockdown, not just in Australia, but across the world, this can be, a real risk factor. So I guess for you guys as future teachers, working with families, it's going to require you to think about their strengths as well as their weaknesses, to think about the causes of child abuse and neglect, and remembering that they're dynamic and ever changing. And I guess it's also important to also consider that in general, families are enormously resilient. And, just because a family may have an employment situation, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be child maltreatment or abuse in the family home. So that's something that we need to consider. A lot of families are very resilient. So next we're going to have a look at 2 clips that can help explain how and why child maltreatment can happen. So while we're watching the clips, I want you to consider some of the risk and protective factors. So in children themselves, in their families, in communities, and also in society as a whole. So research, it suggests that children may learn to be abusive from parents who model abusive behaviour. So modelling can extend also to teachers and to siblings. And also as students move into adolescence, it can include peers, because we know that they can become a big influence. Alternative explanations for maltreatment have been that some children may have a genetic disposition for aggressive behaviour, which can be transformed into child maltreatment when the child becomes an adult. Or it may be that intergenerational transmission is caused by a combination of genetic and social influences. So this clip that we're going to watch, it's an exaggerated reminder of how modelling can impact child behaviour and is a risk factor in terms of intergenerational transmission. So give me a moment and I will get this going. One moment, people. Okay, hopefully you'll be able to see this. Sorry about the quality. Actually, sorry, you couldn't see that, could you? I'll get it right soon. I apologise. Here we go.
Looks like rain again today. Dark clouds gather and fill the sky. Don't know how to talk to you, just know how to say goodbye.
You actually got a driver's license? I don't think so. Did you see it back there, George? Go back where you came from. You understand me? Go back where you came from. What's wrong with you, Harry?
Okay, pretty powerful stuff. We don't want to see that. Okay. So, as I said, this is a exaggerated, very, very exaggerated take. So sorry, I'm just getting back to the slides. There we go. We all back? Everyone see the slides okay? Excellent. Okay, so disturbing, but it really does emphasize that intergenerational transmission. So children see, children do. So this next clip is focused on psychological and developmental theories. So Bowlby's attachment theory specifically. This is where the lack of strong, secure and trusting bonds with both parents can result in children with poor attachment and possibly issues with self-control, with empathy, intimacy, and also low self-worth, which of course, may impact on future relationships. So we'll have a look at this. And again, I want you to think about the risk and protective factors here. Here we go.
The attachment theory argues that a strong emotional and physical bond to one primary caregiver in our first years of life is critical to our development. If our bonding is strong and we are securely attached, then we feel safe to explore the world. We know that there is always that safe base, which we can return to any time. If our bond is weak, we feel insecurely attached. We are afraid to leave or explore a rather scary-looking world because we are not sure if we can return. People who are securely attached are said to have greater trust, can connect to others, and as a result, are more successful in life. Insecurely attached people tend to mistrust others, lack social skills, and have problems forming relationships. There is one type of secure attachment, and there are 3 types of insecure attachments: anxious ambivalent, anxious avoidant, and anxious disorganized. In responses to distress, the first 3 react organized, while the last acts disorganized. To understand the theory better, let's look at Mr. and Mrs. Smith, who have 4 children: Luca, Anne, Joe, and Amy. The Smiths are lovely parents who cuddle, make frequent eye contact, speak warmly, and are always there for their kids. But one day, Mr. Smith falls very sick and dies. For Mrs. Smith, life now becomes very difficult. She spends all day working, while at the same time trying to care for her children. An impossible task. At 6 years of age, Luca's brain is for the most part developed, his character strong and his worldview shaped. The new situation does not affect him much. He knows there is still always Mum, his safe haven. He feels securely attached. Later, he turns into a trusting and optimistic young man. His self-image is positive. Anne, who is 3, has problems coping with the new lack of attention. To Anne, her mother now acts unpredictably. She is anxious about their relationship and as a result becomes clingy. To get her mum's attention, she has to raise her emotional state and scream. When her mum finally reacts with a predictable response, she herself acts ambivalent and doesn't show her true feelings. Later in life, others think Anne is unpredictable or moody. Her self-image is less positive. Her attachment style is anxious ambivalent. 2-year-old Joe spends his days with his uncle, who loves him, but thinks that a good education means being strict. If little Joe shows too much emotion or is too loud, his uncle gets angry and sometimes punitive. This scares Joe. He learns that to avoid fear, he has to avoid showing his feelings, also in other situations. As an adult, he continues this strategy and has problems entering relationships. His image of himself is rather negative. His attachment is anxious avoidant. Amy, who is just 1 year old, gets sent to a nursery. The staff there is poorly trained, overworked, and often very stressed. Some are outright abusive. Amy therefore becomes anxious of the very people she seeks security from, a conflict which totally disorganizes her ideas about love and safety. As she is experiencing fear without resolution, she tries to avoid all social situations. As an adult, she thinks of herself as unworthy of love. Her self-image is very negative. Her attachment is anxious, disorganized. Our attachment is formed in the very first years of our lives, a time when we are too young to communicate our anxiety and as a result can experience high levels of stress. Then our adrenal gland, an organ sitting on top of our kidneys, produces the stress hormones adrenaline and cortisol. The heart rate increases, the blood pressure goes up, and we become alert. If that happens frequently, it is called toxic stress. Toxic because it impairs the development of a child's brain and weakens the immune system. In embryos or at a very young age, toxic stress can even switch the expressions of genes, which can affect our health many decades later. By simulating a strange situation, we can assess an attachment style already by the age of 1. To do this, we let the child play with their mother for a few minutes inside a room. Then the child is left alone. The key moment is the child's reaction when her mother returns. Securely attached children first usually hug their mother, then can calm down and eventually get back to playing. Insecurely attached children can be ambivalent and avoidant. Some can't stop crying or refuse to continue playing. The long-term effects of our attachment in the early years are well documented. Using the theory, researchers at Minnesota University were able to predict already at age 3 if a child would drop out of high school with 77% accuracy. In another study, undergraduates at Harvard were asked to assess how close they felt to their parents. 35 years later, they were asked about their health. 91% of those who said they had a rather broken relationship with their mother were also diagnosed with health issues, including coronary artery disease, hypertension, and alcoholism. For those that had reported a warm relationship, the figure of poor health diagnosis was just 45%. But there is another reason why the early years deserve special attention. They are the starting place for subsequent behaviors. A kid that feels securely attached at age 2 can make friends at kindergarten. Their worldview gets reinforced with every interaction, and they develop optimism. As a result, they make good relationships at school, then at college, and later at work. Highly insecurely attached children can miss out on this opportunity. Psychologist John Bowlby, a pioneer in attachment theory, allegedly said, "What cannot be communicated to the mother cannot be communicated to the self." In other words, those who feel insecurely attached might not quite understand themselves. To get to know who they are and what they feel, they might have to go way back in time.
Okay, so I guess that probably took you back to your child development. Yeah, your child development unit and Bowlby and the strange situation. Do we all remember that? Okay, I'm going to come back to the PowerPoint. And I am going to turn the camera back on. There we go. All right, so what did we think? What are some of the risk factors that we noted there? As I said, you can think about the risk factors and protective factors, but at this point, I just want to talk about the risk factors. Anyone note any particularly? You're welcome to type it into the chat if you want to. Yeah? Who would like to share? What are some risk factors that you noted in those 2 videos? No one wants to share?
I was going to say that that lack of attachment in those very early years can then lead on to a lot of social issues, which could then lead on to a lot, they become that socially awkward child, or the parents can't deal with them because of their social emotional problems,
Yeah.
and that can lead to other
Yeah.
abusive situations as well. So it's sort of like this ongoing cycle.
Yeah. And so we're also, I guess, temperament
Yeah.
can be a big factor there. Yeah, definitely. I think, though, that isolation and lack of support is a big one. So when there is no one, like such as an extended family or friends, or a partner or community support to help with all those demands of parenting, I think that could be a risk factor. And stress as well, financial pressures, job worries, medical problems, taking care of a family member with a disability, or a parent as well. Another area I think that can be really, and this I guess gets back to temperament, is unrealistic expectations. So a lack of understanding of a child or a young person's developmental stages and behaviour. That can be a big risk factor as well. And parenting skills, not knowing how to help children and young people learn and grow and behave in a positive way. Not everyone is born with good parenting skills. This is why there are lots of positive parenting workshops and things that a lot of schools actually have them. Has anyone been to a positive parenting workshop? I used to, when I was directing long day childcare centres, we would have them normally twice a year. So it's really important to help parents, to support them. Low self-esteem and self-confidence, poor childhood experiences, all of these things can be risk factors as well. So I've got a bit of a summary here of risk and protective factors. Have concentrated on the risk factors very much, but we can see the protective factors there as well. And of course, an easy temperament is a big one. Family, stable home environment, high quality education and care services. So this is a big factor, like having really good early years services, prior to school settings, kindergartens, that really give children those strong attachments, as well as parents and carers as well. And societal as well, inclusion, access to support services, as we said, and of course economic security or access to funds in some way, whether it be government assistance. Anything else that anyone wanted to add at all? Okay, moving on. So everything that children do after their abuse is designed to keep them safe. So trauma can impact on cognitive development and the cognitive structures of the brain. And this is something that you would have read about and learnt about in your child development unit. So, release of stress hormones, when repeated, it creates an overabundance, and this can cause damage to the structure of the brain, especially in very young children. So young children or young people who have experienced trauma, they're always in a hypervigilant state, and this can inhibit the development of other neural pathways, so things like decision making and judgment as well. And actual cognitive delays can occur, so language delays, and this might involve not being able to give instructions. They you may notice that some children may use more words than they should, or their language may be difficult to understand. And I guess we expect that children can make good choices, but with these sorts of language or cognitive impairments or difficulties, children aren't able to make those good choices. So we need to think about the possible reasons behind the behaviour that children might exhibit. So, secure attachment, it's the foundation for all further development. And children who have experienced trauma, they have disorganized attachment, as we saw in the clip. So, this is where that foundation for future relationships is really impaired, and it can cause difficulty in social contexts and in behaviour. And it's also important to remember that trauma triggers. So trauma triggers are things that remind the child of a trauma, and these may be obvious or evident to people around them. And we need to understand these reactions and remember that these reactions actually help the child to get through a difficult experience. And so this takes time and understanding. And often in these situations, you'll be working with possibly psychologists or pediatricians or healthcare workers to help students as well. So it's important to, develop an understanding of some of what these triggers might look like. So I guess very importantly, it's important to remember that learners with traumatic experiences, they really can have their learning, their behaviour and relationships impacted. So trauma-sensitive education settings are really important. So places that help or enable children to feel safe and to learn that they're needed. And of course, this it actually requires a whole school effort. And at the moment, I think it's becoming more and more a focus of educational reform. So, as I said before, we will talk about a teacher's role in terms of prevention. And I guess we need to remember that as children, they spend much of their time at childcare and then at school. And these environments, they need to provide safe, structured places that, they do have the potential to support and prevent child maltreatment and violence, to support children who have experienced this. And teachers have an important role to play in child protection. It lies not only in the detection and the reporting of possible cases of child abuse, but also in that multidisciplinary teamwork, contributing to the ongoing support and monitoring of maltreated children. So we can see on the slide are some strategies to assist teachers. So we talk about preventing, recognising, reporting, responding, and very importantly, collaborating. So there are many ways to recognise maltreatment. So the child or young person, they may tell you or write about an injury or an event that they've experienced or that they have. They may tell you or write about that they've been abused in some way or draw possibly. Children may say or write that they know someone who is being abused. You may note unexplained marks or changes in behaviour. And you may note that a child has poor concentration or attention or hypervigilance. So you may notice a real change in behaviour in this way. You may notice that they may have complaints about aches or pains, or, there may be no physical evidence. I guess it's important to remember that individually, any one indicator may not really enable you to form a reasonable suspicion, but we need to consider anything that we see. So knowledge or reasonable suspicion is needed to make a report. And reasonable suspicion can be based on first-hand observations of harmful treatment of a child. It could be the child's condition, what they say, what the parent or caregiver says. Could be actual disclosure. It could be prior reports as well. That's why it's important to keep, in terms of administration, to note anything that you see, to see if it's, it's a regular occurrence. So you need to take written notes if you begin to have concerns, and make sure that they're as factual as possible. So there will be specific policies and procedures in individual schools, and some may be different, but the majority of them, they're statewide in terms of recognising and reporting. So in February 2019, the National Principles for Child Safe Organisations, they were endorsed by COAG, by the Council of Australian Governments. And so they developed 10 principles aiming to provide a nationally consistent approach to creating organisational cultures that foster child safety and well-being. So I popped, we're not going to watch this clip, but I popped it there for you to have a look at later down the track if you want to. So the graphic on the page, it depicts the 10-point star known as the Wheel of Child Safety. So the points on the star match the 10 child safe principles. So the clip, it provides details of these, so you may like to have a look at it. So it involves committed leadership and governance culture in schools and prior to school settings, ensuring children and young people are safe, informed, and actively participate in organisations. Families and communities are involved in safety settings, that equity and diversity is promoted, that recruitment is robust with screening, safety precautions, effective complaints management. So if something is reported, that it is actually not just neglected, that something's done about it. Very importantly, ongoing education and training for all stakeholders. And something that is really important now is safe physical environments, but also online environments as well. Regular improvement and definitely evaluation of policies and procedures as well. And, really good child safety and wellbeing policies and procedures that are evaluated regularly, and making sure that there are good inductions in schools and prior to school settings to make sure that all people involved have a good understanding of these. And that's why it's important when you go on your placements that you do check the policies and do talk to your supervising teachers about their child protection and reporting policies. It's something that you really need to do as part of your induction. So I think we need to remember that protecting children is part of our work. It's anchored in professional standards for teachers. In some ways, teachers may be the only person who can help. So when a child is being abused, it will not go away and often becomes more serious over time. So, reporting child abuse and neglect can stop the abuse or neglect, and it can begin providing children help and also families help as well. So teachers' responses, teachers' observations are very important. It's very important that you develop that knowledge and know-how, that you have those skill sets, so that you read your child protection policy, that you know what needs or can be reported or what must be reported, when to start the reporting process and what type of report is required, how you go about reporting and who to report to. So policies are there to explain what is required of you. And as I said, it's mainly consistent across schools and prior to school settings. There are standard policies that teachers need to abide by. So as a teacher in Queensland, you're bound by both legislative, so mandatory, and occupational duties, so those based on the school policy. And in most cases, these will be similar, or possibly sometimes a bit broader. So Queensland's mandatory reporting duty in the Child Protection Act, it actually limits the duty to suspicions of significant harm, as we discussed before. So harm, it's a technical term defined as those where the matter involves any detrimental effect of a significant nature. So on the child's physical, psychological, or emotional well-being. So this harm needs to be substantial or serious in nature. So I've provided some links for further information and clarification of this. And I think, again, it's an area that needs close investigation, so to have a good knowledge base and understanding. So we're going to move on to online safety now. And again, this is something that you would have discussed in child development, but I just want to summarise it here. So online safety education is really vital because it builds knowledge and skills across all of the key learning areas. It includes technical and interpersonal aspects. It addresses all the key risk factors and protective factors in terms of online use. So education, it needs to involve timely evidence-based information. So this would be regarding cyberbullying, online sexual abuse and grooming, internet and gaming addiction, online pornography, and also hate speech as well. So in a school, the culture, it needs to be one that concerns allegations of harm, to take these allegations seriously, and where there's quality education and training for all staff, and the application of cyber safety tools across schools. So there's lots of hardware and software that schools used. My son's school has them, but a lot of students take in their own devices as well. So this is an issue. And parents, they really need to be involved in this as well. So with continuity between home and school. Very important, and this needs to start at a very, very young age as well, because as we've discussed previously in the unit, children are starting to use devices at a younger and younger age, and often not supervised. So on the slide, I'd like you to take note of these. They should be recent ones, so that the links should be active. They're community-based resources that you might want to take note of for your future practice. Really important that you have a toolkit to assist you. So this is available, the PowerPoint's available on Blackboard. So all of these may be relevant to you at some point in time. So on the slide as well is a link to the Department of Child Safety, Youth and Women. So it has further information about mandatory reporting. Something that you need to be aware of, though, that something that you need to be aware of is that, sorry, I'm trying to get the video on. There I am. Sorry about that. That the names of departments are subject to change. So it's something that you need to consider. So we're not going to go through these tonight. We've got limited numbers here, and a lot of you are watching the recording. So what I've done, I've got, actually I'll come back to because I know Abigail, I know you looked at this, but I want to point out to you that I've got some case studies that I popped on the slides, and I want you to actually go through them in your own time. Those of you who are watching the recording, there's 2 case studies, and I want you to go through the studies and think about the scenarios and reflect on these questions. So these are what we've been through basically in the workshop today. And I want you to really think about what it might mean in the 2 particular scenarios. So the article from The Guardian that I asked you to have a look at prior to the workshop, it was about a woman's reaction to a mother shaking her child on a bus. And the article was followed by 645 reactions and comments from readers. So it clearly had a significant impact. So I think, Abigail, it was, you read through the article. What were your thoughts? What did you notice about people's reactions?
I think like a lot of them were similar, but then there was like the few that stood out and people like really didn't agree with what they believed. Like I think one that stood out for me was the whole like we should leave them the way it is, it works, or something like that. Yeah. Suggesting that just don't comment or do anything to intervene because it'll sort itself out.
Yeah. Yeah. Or I think one of the points as well that it may actually have more of an impact. You know, it might actually cause more issues for the child. Has anyone ever been in a situation like this where they have seen a, you know, in a supermarket or something where a parent smacks a child, or has anyone been in that situation before? No?
Not smacking so much. I've heard some, like the way they're yelling at the child or speaking to the child in the supermarket, and you just kind of think, oh, yeah, it can be really quite disturbing, but yeah, not the physical.
Yeah, so it's really interesting though, because if you haven't had a look at the article, it's hard to discuss it if you haven't had a look at it. But I really want you to have a look at it, and you know, consider, because you may come across this yourselves, and you know, people's reactions to seeing a child being, well, abused is, again, it's coming back to what we discussed before, our perception of what abuse is. Some people may think that yelling at a child is abuse. Some people may not consider a parent smacking their child as abuse. So, you know, you need to think about if it's subjective or objective. So what are people's thoughts? Are you comfortable sharing these thoughts? Because, you know, your perceptions about this will have an impact on your teaching in the future. What are our thoughts? I understand completely if you don't want to share them, especially the session.
I was just going to say, it's an area that, like when you talk about smacking, it's something that's changed quite a bit, like even in my lifetime. Like me as a young child would have been smacked, I assume, when I did something wrong. But my children, it was already, like my daughter's 23, it was already to the point when she was born that you certainly wouldn't do it in public. And it was starting to be like, you don't smack children. And to the point that now it's like, yeah, don't smack them ever.
Yeah, yeah. But it's also, as a child, my father, you know, his very 50s male, he always used to say children should be seen and not heard. And, you know, in some ways that can be considered neglect, can't it? If you know, it really does depend. And it's cultural as well. Like in some cultures, children are encouraged to be involved, you know, Italian families sitting at a table, you know, often everyone's sitting around together and discussing, and children have a voice. But in some cultures, children sit at a children's table, and that, you know, they should be seen and not heard. So what one culture may believe is very different to another. So again, we need to take these into consideration as teachers. So we've talked about a lot this evening, and as I said, some of it is a little bit confronting. I find that children see and children do. Every time I watch it, I find that really disturbs me, and it's so exaggerated, but it really does give an indication. And that was actually an ad. Does anyone remember? It was quite a few years ago. It was on TV. Yeah, but it had a big impact on me at the time. Okay, so there's a lot of information and also a lot of resources that we've gone through today. And, you know, there is a recording there, and the PowerPoint slides are available on Blackboard as well if you do want to go over anything again. And I will be putting a Padlet up if you wanted to put any comments up there, or you have any questions as well. But again, there's a reminder here as well. You know, it can raise issues that you may like to speak to someone about. And that's a very normal reaction as well. Okay, now I've also provided the references as well here for you that I have used. So you're welcome if you wanted to do some further reading, you're welcome to, but I really would encourage you, those 4 articles, it really does help you have a bit of a critical understanding about some of the issues, especially around definitions that are used and what we were talking about in terms of being, objective about it as teachers as well, which can be very difficult, especially on an issue as confronting as this one. Okay, so I'm imagining that I will have my COVID test back soon, so we'll be back on campus next week. Mind you, it is nice to have have a Zoom session and have our external students. So that's always lovely. And just to remind you as well about those in the coming weeks, if you do need to have a Zoom session to discuss your assessment, I would very much encourage that. Okay, I'm going to turn the recording off now. So I'll say goodbye to everyone online.